I always try to make a few remarks about the importance of our website, and I'll get to that in just a moment. I want to just do a little experiment here. I'd like everybody to close their eyes. Just close your eyes, everybody. Now, with your eyes closed, raise your hand if you watched the coronation. I knew that one. All right, well, most of you didn't, and I don't blame you at all. I didn't either, but I did watch excerpts of it, and if you were watching closely, it was remarkable how Catholic it was. And we had an article or two on the website about that. It reminds you how misguided and lost the English are in terms of their faith, and how deep the roots of Catholicism run in Great Britain. I mean, it's just unbelievable. Other than the consecrations, other than the consecrated host and a few other things, each of the elements were there. The anointing of the king behind the screen, if you ever, I mean, that part was really bizarre, I thought. But it is very akin to what a bishop does in the Catholic Church. And this is the kind of stuff you can get insight to and read about on our website. And that website is CatholicCitizens.org. Give yourselves away. I know you're not visiting. You need to visit. CatholicCitizens.org. It's really interesting stuff. It's always good. Among other things, there was a great article about Father Martin, who's doing his gay outreach thing. Just right to the heart of the matter about how false charity that is that Father Martin is engaging in with gays. So-called gays, I don't like to concede there is even such a thing. So again, there's just great stuff that bolsters the faith, gives you ammunition, not ammunition in a military sense, but gives you confidence to talk about these things if and when they come up. And that's why we maintain the site. I now would like to invite Father Heinlein, our chaplain, up for grace.
Well, I'm really happy to be here because Cardinal George is a friend of mine, and he was a great bishop, and I miss him terribly. Even Father, just love you in the Spirit. Amen. Bless us, O Lord, in these thy gifts, which we are about to receive thy power in Christ our Lord. Amen. Now let's just have this moment of prayer, huh? Because we spend some time, no time to pray, huh? No time to pray. But we should pray every day to God our Father, who loves us so much, more than we love ourselves. And that's our blessed God, who is a Father to us. A Father who loves us more than any father would. More than we love ourselves, huh? And so we turn to him, huh? And the psalm says, we turn to you, O Lord, because you are good, because you are kind, you are loving, and we want to be your friend and your love and your son and daughter. We ask this all through Christ our Lord. Amen.
Our speaker today is Heinlein, editor of Super Catholic, and I don't want to confuse you with any other prominent websites, but Simply Catholic can be found at simplycatholic.com. I'll just forget that and remember CatholicCitizens.org. The mission of Simply Catholic is simple: to help Catholics know and love the Lord and His Church so that they may be equipped to share their Catholic faith with others. The ministry of our Sunday Visitor, which has been sharing the truth beauty and goodness of Catholicism since 1912. And by the way, I guess you've actually, Michael, written some of the pamphlets that they circulate. I have found our Sunday Visitor pamphlets uniformly superb, and that's interesting to hear. Michael is the author of several Our Sunday Visitor booklets and pamphlets, including Go Therefore and Make Disciples, Missionary Saints in the Church, and Saints in Times of Crisis. He's also author of several children's books, and of course, the biography of Cardinal George. Please welcome Michael Heinlein.
Thanks very much. It's a great pleasure to be here and talk about someone that I've talked about probably more than anybody with my 6-year-old son, which tells you about how much I've been in the weeds with Cardinal George for the past few years. I started this book about 6 months after he died, and then about a year after he died, it really kind of started taking shape. And the book's been out since March, and I'm very grateful that there have been so many folks interested, because I think Cardinal George lived a fascinating life. And we all know, to one degree or another, some of the fascinating aspects of that life. Certainly I did, starting this project. But I didn't know quite how fascinating it was, because he never talked about himself all that much. And so the things that I was able to accumulate, I think really it's just the beginning. I think that there's a lot more that we can still learn from Cardinal George and still learn about Cardinal George. Just making my way around the Midwest the last couple months with this book and meeting people and hearing more and more stories that I would have loved to have included in the book. But I think that we can also see that Cardinal George's story isn't certainly over, because if you look at his grave and displays, and you can see the signs of many visitors, many people who are turning to him now, still as a pastor, but as one who intercedes. And so I hope and pray that that will continue, because I think that his life will certainly continue to inspire many other generations to come. My job here today isn't to talk to you all about that fascinating life. I don't plan to give you a detailed outline of the Cardinal's life, because I think that we know a lot of those details already, but I also think that the book does a good enough job of that. But with our time together today, I'd like to unpack a little bit of what I see as the Cardinal's virtuous life. Made virtuous because it was joined to Christ crucified in a very intimate way. This directly relates to the title of the book, which is Glorifying Christ. And so in the beginning of my reflections today, I will endeavor to provide a framework for an examination of Cardinal George's virtue through the lens of that title. The night before he died, Christ, during his high priestly prayer at the Last Supper, which is recorded in John's Gospel, gives some very powerful words that the Church still is coming to fully understand with our prayer. Christ prayed to his Father for those of us who will endeavor to follow him. He said, I'm praying for them, Father. I'm praying not for the world, but for those you've given me, because they're yours. And everything of mine is yours, and yours is mine. And I am glorified in them. What is Jesus saying here? Jesus is showing us that he is a shepherd concerned about his sheep till the very end. He is a shepherd who says, that inasmuch as we are his sheep, we are his. And he is glorified in us. That means that we pray that he's glorified in us every moment of every day. Christ doesn't talk about what he did. Christ doesn't talk about himself being examined through any other lens than how we are glorifying him. And so this means, of course, that insofar as we are Christ's, insofar as we belong to him, we glorify him. It's my own assessment, after nearly 7 years of examining the life of Francis Eugene George, Oblate of Mary Immaculate, 5th Bishop of Yakima, 9th Archbishop of Portland, and 8th Archbishop of Chicago, that he was a man who belonged completely to Christ. How is it that he or any of us become completely Christ's? St. Paul taught that when we are in Christ and Christ is in us, we are one with him. We are one with him when we live like him, when we do as he commanded, when we offer our lives with his for the good of others, in a living embodiment of St. Paul's admonition to the Romans to live as a living sacrifice, holy and pleasing to God, your spiritual worship. When we are completely Christ's, we give him glory, not only by uniting ourselves to him and clinging to him, but by imitating him, being a disciple of Jesus. And that discipleship, we know, is more than being a good listener or a good student. That discipleship has as its measure, as the Master himself tells us, whoever wishes to come after me must deny himself, take up his cross, and follow me. So our discipleship means carrying the cross, and it's not just any cross. It is the cross of Christ. It has to be like his, or we can't follow him. I have seen up close, in examining Francis George's life, that he carried such a cross his entire life. And by doing so, he glorified Christ. By doing so, he showed the depth of his virtue and his discipleship. Just as the weight of Christ's cross became more burdensome with the passage of each moment, we know when praying the Stations of the Cross, he fell 3 times. So too did Francis George's cross. And he indeed fell, often literally, because the effects of polio left him weak. So did cancer. But he resolved always, man of perseverance that he was, to get up and carry on. Many people commented to me when they would see him fall in front of the altar at Mass, he'd get up, I'm all right, move on. Where does such resolve come from? I think it can only come from being intimately acquainted with Christ's cross, by following its way, by taking the route that Christ took. And we know that that route took Francis George's to places that he would have never imagined or even hoped to go. Many times didn't want to go. As a young man, he believed that God intended him to follow a path to the priesthood in Chicago. An unimaginable turn of events, however, would put an end to that dream, as many of us know. And for this reason, the words he spoke in 1997 to his new hometown flock who once shunned him were like a line from divine poetry. He said, on the day he was appointed to Chicago, "Now I give the rest of my life to Chicago." And he really did. But then he said, "I certainly never imagined I'd be in this position. God has a sense of humor." We know that if the Archdiocese of Chicago had its way, Cardinal George would have never been a priest in the first place. He was effectively barred from ordination when he was 14. Manifesting his courage, determination, and perseverance from that young age, though, he turned elsewhere in answering the call to priesthood. He had never heard any other calling from the day of his first communion. May 6, 1945, at St. Pascal's. He knew he was to be a priest. He knew it was a must. Following that path meant that he was destined to places beyond his hometown, though. Like a true missionary, when he left his Chicago neighborhood, he did so fully prepared never to return. But why did the Archdiocese reject that application? As was the norm for anyone in his day who was interested in diocesan priesthood during an era when there were a lot of vocations, the candidate had to work his way through a system that began by attending Quigley Preparatory Seminary, the Archdiocesan School. Franny, as his friends called him back then, had applied to Quigley, and he was accepted in his 8th grade year to be a student, though. Because things took a dramatic turn in the end of 1950 in his 8th grade year at St. Pascal's School, when polio came. That was a game changer, and all bets were off regarding his future as a priest in Chicago. I found in my research that many people have never really understood the circumstances of this quite fully, because the Cardinal didn't talk about it all that much. That made my life rather interesting in researching him, though, because there were not a lot of first-person records of his own biography. This, however, there was one quote I found in the parish history of St. Pascal's that was very illuminating. Because while he shied from talking about his disability, while he might have acknowledged even his own physical limitations, he was reluctant to put any spotlight on his suffering and pain. If anything, he wanted to avoid being pitied or given any sympathy. This was also true when he was a young boy. While the effects of polio would have made getting downtown to Quigley a difficulty, Franny, on crutches at the time, was determined. So he made the trek to Quigley, where he was faced with rejection. They said, "You can come to school here." But as the Cardinal said, quote, "They were very clear, very kind, but very clear to me. You can come to school here because you have a good record and you're well recommended by your pastor. But you should know you will never be a priest in Chicago." No reason given, only implied. One might think such news would squash any kind of priestly vocation or perhaps drive a wedge in his faith. But this bleak pronouncement didn't deter Franny. He said, "I thought about that for a day and said, well, to heck with you guys." Most impressive, though, in this whole narrative of his polio was a story that his sister Margaret shared with me during his hospitalization in Evanston for several months. The young Franny would share a room with an older man, and his mother would often come in and find this older man speaking with Franny. And that man reported to Franny's mother that sometimes the boy would fall silent in their conversations. And what would the man see when he'd look over at young Franny, this teenage interlocutor who he thought maybe fell asleep? He saw Franny looking up at the cross. Francis George, already at this age, already seemed to know where we should turn to when we want to make sense of life, where we want to make sense of the crosses that come our way. For if we see our cross through the prism of Christ's own, then our crosses become like his. Our crosses become no longer obstacles to human flourishing, but an opportunity to bring life to others. By all accounts, Franny's battle with polio taught him to understand suffering had a purpose. It was redemptive. He learned to trust that God's ways are better than our own. He came to see polio, he said, as a gift. At the end of his funeral mass in 2015, in the homily of the funeral mass in 2015, Archbishop Peter Sarton neatly summarized this when he said, quote, "Francis George's own lifelong wrestling in a body struck by polio gave him lasting insight into the mystery of the cross through a wound that was not somehow just his, but also Christ's, end quote. Many years later, as Archbishop of Chicago, George began to sense something familiar when he was blessing the newly installed Stations of the Cross at St. James the Greater Parish in suburban Sauk Village. Looking at them, he soon realized that these refurbished stations had been formerly in the chapel at St. Francis Hospital in Evanston, where he spent several months with polio. And he impromptu announced to the people gathered there that as he gazed upon these stations that day, he realized that those were the ones he gazed upon for hours, untold hours, he said, during his hospitalization. The story of his life would show that he understood he could do anything through Christ, his strength. Years later, as a cardinal of the church, Franny, the Archbishop of Chicago, told a group of teens that polio left him, quote, a captive in my own body, but I soon learned that self-pity got me nowhere. Faith was the way out, because in faith I was not alone, and good can come of something that appears to be bad, end quote. That faith became the means then for the carrying of the cross throughout his life, and it provided him with strength, courage, and determination that was needed to persevere in glorifying Christ. As I mentioned previously, that cross began getting heavier as he learned the disability from polio would prevent him from being a priest in Chicago, but no one could keep him away from that call. When the crosses in his life came his way, he embraced them. He once said, and I think this is a key to Francis George's life, quote, life is not a self-directed project, but a consistent response to what is asked by those you love. He did that, day in and day out, quietly, unassumingly. He learned how to make a sacrifice of his life through this experience, how to make an offering, an oblation of himself. He did that as an oblate of Mary Immaculate, rather fittingly. Since Chicago wouldn't take him, he joined the Oblates of Mary Immaculate in Belleville, downstate. And it was providential that he ended up with them, I think. Because in addition to the 3 vows of any professed religious, poverty, chastity, and obedience, the Oblates take a 4th vow, which really seems to have been made for Franny, the vow of perseverance. That required the kind of grit, determination, and tenacity that he had in spades. And then, with only about a decade after his ordination to the priesthood, at 37, he was drawn into the administration of this community that he never imagined joining. The Oblates of Mary Immaculate, when he was elected Vicar General, and he had to move to Rome. This congregation who accepted him, who welcomed him, when his hometown wouldn't, turned to him for leadership at a time in which they were caught in internal turmoil. These were the confusing post-Vatican II years when, like many communities, the Oblates had priests who were leaving in droves, and perhaps most disturbingly, their superior general left 2 years after his election to marry a religious woman. The community was in shock by that because he was the first American they ever elected superior general. And they said, we'll never elect another American. But then Francis George opened his mouth at the general chapter and they changed their mind. They wanted him as superior general, but he begged them off and said, I'm too young. So they elected him number 2 instead. But this crisis within his community even postponed the beatification of their founder, St. Eugene de Mazenod, now canonized. But the canonization came about because of the internal reform and renewal that Francis George helped bring about in that community. He's remembered by his brother Oblates as an authentic religious, as someone who lived what he preached. He was an exhausting breakfast partner, I understand. People felt they needed a nap after breakfast with him because he talked so much about such deep things. But Cardinal George consistently lived that line that I quoted before. He responded to what was asked by those who loved him and who he loved. There's an old saying that there are 2 kinds of priests. Those who think on the day of their priesthood ordination, that's the last time they'll have hands laid on their head. And then there are those who think the opposite. who think one day I'll be a bishop. George certainly didn't have any ambition toward upward mobility. His past rejection and his joining of a religious congregation meant, at least in his day, that there was no upward mobility in the clerical caste. But nonetheless, he became a bishop and in 1990 was ordained. But he was a different kind of bishop. He was a bishop who had never angled for promotion. He had no diocesan chancery experience. He was never a bishop's secretary. He taught no diocesan seminaries. And he was a rarity among bishops in that he had 2 earned doctorates. He was a servant of a congregation, and he was an intellectual. He was quiet, he was unassuming, he was diligent, and he also knew how to carry the cross. When Francis George became a bishop, he chose the motto, "To Christ be glory in the church," originating from Paul's letter to the Ephesians. And it was an apt motto, I think, for he desired that the souls he shepherded would become the saints God made them to be. And that, after all, is the primary means by which we glorify God in the church. Looking at his life, it's clear that George had ample reason then to later elaborate on his motto as being connected not only to glorifying Christ, but also how to accept sacrifice and suffering in the Christian life. He once wrote about this, about how martyrdom is tied to his episcopal motto. He said, quote, "The privileged way of giving glory to Christ in the church is to suffer martyrdom. Not yet called a bloody martyrdom, though. We need to become ever clearer and more intentional about how we are to witness to the Lord and give him glory through the offering of our lives, the joining of our self-sacrifice to his." End quote. I want to just dwell on these lines. We are to witness to the Lord and give him glory through the offering of our lives for the rest of the time we have together, and how those manifest themselves in the life of Francis George. I think those words would be easy to write, but it's more heroic to live it. And he did it marvelously. Francis George gave witness to the Lord and offered his life in the ways he carried the cross. Needless to say, a cross that got very heavy as each year went by. It got really heavy, he wrote, when he became a bishop. And particularly, I can tell how heavy it got when he became Archbishop of Chicago. I began a chapter in the book in which I chronicle some of his most frustrating episodes from his time in Chicago with a line from St. Augustine, which I can only imagine would have stirred in Francis George's heart and mind many days. In fact, his last book, A Godly Humanism, he chose to have a picture of St. Augustine on the cover of the book. He was very close, spiritually and intellectually, to St. Augustine. This is the quote. "The day I became a bishop, a burden was laid on my shoulders for which it will be no easy task to render an account. To be honest with you, my obligations involve me in so much turmoil that I feel as though I were tossed by storms on a great ocean." End quote. It's through that lens that I think we can see how Cardinal George most especially heroically gave witness to the Lord and offered his life. Given his extensive background in ecclesiastical governance, more than 4 decades between the time he was elected Vicar General to the time he retired, he was asked by CBS 2's Jay Levine, "What's the best assignment you've ever had?" And with his characteristic smile, Cardinal George responded, "Well, Archbishop of Chicago, of course." Levine followed up by asking, "What's the most challenging assignment you've ever had?" George instantly replied, "Archbishop of Chicago, beyond any doubt." George had already been warned about the difficulties of being Archbishop of Chicago, rather prophetically, a few years before his predecessor died, Cardinal Joseph Bernardini. They were together one night in Rome, staying at the North American College, where they were both staying as participants of the 1994 Synod on Consecrated Life. Bernardini discussed the deep divisions in the Archdiocese of Chicago one night over a glass of milk. with the man who would, unbeknownst to them, succeed him less than 3 years later. When George expressed his disconcern at what he was hearing, Bernadine smiled at him and said, "Well, you know, Francis, Chicago is sometimes ungovernable." Among the manifestations of this reality was the fact that Chicago operated in the way that the cardinal was often the last to know about things. He said as much in an internal memo in 2006 to archdiocesan employees. Quote, "I was puzzled by a system that almost systematically seemed to exclude the office of archbishop from information, especially from bad news. Sometimes it seemed motivated by a protective concern not to burden the archbishop, sometimes by a conviction that it was really none of his business. But in too many areas, the byword seemed to be, 'Don't tell the cardinal,'" end quote. He continued in the memo, arguing, quote, "The quality of governance depends upon the flow of information. Information in any office, except in the case of health or finance records, is not something to be guarded rather than shared," end quote. Later on, in a private note I found from the cardinal, he would come to find that Chicago is, quote, "locked into patterns of self-destruction that I am powerless to change." Yet George believed that, quote, "a crisis of authority in the church cannot be resolved if bishops don't act like bishops." So he tried very hard to be a good bishop. And when asked how he'd like to be remembered, he said, "I'd like to be remembered as a good bishop." The struggles he faced as Archbishop of Chicago, largely built upon opposition to him publicly and privately, were all the more painful for George since he had arrived in his new assignment in 1997, intending to focus on local governance. Despite his eventual rise to national leadership, most notably as president of the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops, and many other pivotal roles nationally and internationally even, George had not planned to immerse himself in any kind of national policy as his predecessor, Cardinal Bernardin, had. He said, "I had no intention of trying to be a competitor with Cardinal Bernardin." He told his priests that in 2006. He continued, quote, "I have very little interest in national policy for many reasons. I have no intention of trying to fill his shoes, and I still don't. I think each of us brings something, and none of us replaces anybody else. But I knew that to some extent, you did have to get used to somebody with a slightly lower profile, as I would have hoped to have, a much quieter one, because I'm much more at ease with that," end quote. But God had other plans, of course, and George embraced them all for the good of the church, for the good of the people that he loved, no matter the ways in which it would continue to require him to give greater witness to the Lord and offer himself more fully. But George's intention to be more low-key was grounded in his understanding of what his vocation as a bishop was to be. He said it was his deep conviction, quote, "that bishops are not the church," end quote, adding, quote, "both the liberals and conservatives put too much emphasis on the bishops, so the idea of being in some sense a guru or being some kind of mythic figure is not who I am or who I am in my own understanding," end quote. Some of the idea that bishops were equal to the church, of course, stemmed from the Illinois state law created decades before, a practice not uncommon throughout the United States, but legendarily effective in Chicago, known as Corporation Sole. That system of organizing diocesan properties and institutions where the archdiocesan ordinary or archbishop solely manages the assets of the archdiocese. The name of Chicago's archbishop, therefore, is on every title of every parish school and other institute. This legally was created as a reality back to the great institutional builder of Chicago, Cardinal George Mundelein, who helped the local faithful emerge from a minority status and take on greater roles of responsibility in society, utilizing Corporation Sole to build that massive institutional structure Chicago was known for around the world. Cardinal George explained, however, to a gathering of priests in Chicago that he saw the existence of Corporation Sole as something of a myth, something ironically opposed to the reality of his job. Quote, Whatever it means, it was simply designed as a way to protect the assets of the church civilly, while we govern according to the code of canon law in which every parish is a corporation. End quote. Instead, it ended up meaning that lay people considered the ordinary to be fully in control, all-knowing and all-powerful. George lamented this greatly. He lamented how far this was from the truth, and he admitted that his style of governance, this particular style of governance, was very isolating to him. And I can't tell you how many times I saw private notes where he felt very, very alone in the Archdiocese of Chicago. He said when he got to Chicago that the job puzzled him quite a bit because of all this organizational structure. He said, I'm a man who's had a lot of jobs, who have done a lot of things very well, fairly well. I have a sense of my limitations, and I'm not falsely modest. I've done a lot of things around the world and in the church. So I came here with that expectation that it would take me a while, but eventually I'd get the hang of it. And I have a very hard time working into it. That was 10 years before he retired. It really seems that he did. He always did. At various points during his tenure in Chicago, he occasionally wrote privately about how he felt like a failure in Chicago. How he felt that there were various shades of corruption in Chicago that weakened the church's mission. He said that he felt that he detested the political life of the city, which made his job so difficult. He saw the presbyteries infected with money and sex. But nonetheless, through all of this, Cardinal George pressed on. He continued giving witness to the Lord and offering himself. Father Andrew Greeley, who was an odd bedfellow with Cardinal George, and that they'd go to the opera together, have dinner together occasionally, who was very critical of various archbishops of Chicago, remarked in 1998 that George was the best archbishop Chicago ever had, noting that he was, quote, one of the most brilliant and erudite men I've ever met. Later that year, he said, quote, whether he could administer the large, complex, and since Cody, disoriented archdiocese remains to be seen. If he can't, then no one can. Whether he'll be able to do it, to build a competent staff, also remains to be seen, especially since, like Dave Wanstead, he doesn't have much of a bench. Finally, it remains to be seen whether those priests of the archdiocese who are intimidated by his brilliance and quickness will learn how to argue back. End quote. That was 1998. Now, it's no small secret that in order for bishops to govern well, they need, most of all, the cooperation of their priests. And the biggest question of George's governance in Chicago was how to bring that about. 5 months into his tenure, before Greeley wrote those words I just read, the former president of the Association of Chicago Priests, then Cathedral Rector Father Robert McLaughlin, rallied a sizable group of priests called the Pastors' Forum. They formed this different sort of McLaughlin group shortly after George's arrival to voice their complaints about him to the Apostolic Nuncio. The aim of the group, which identified itself by a letter with 43 signatories out of just over 900 archdiocesan priests, was to put the new archbishop in his place. The letter made national headlines. It was covered in the New York Times. These priests admitted their complaints were fueled by rumors after Bernardine's death that, quote, the Vatican intended to appoint a new archbishop who would shape up this wild group, end quote. If even Christ was thrown out of his own town for speaking the truth, then why should Francis George have been any exception? In a 2012 report that he sent to the Holy See about the status of his archdiocese, George said that many Chicago priests prided themselves on, quote, a mythic past when Chicago led the nation in many ecclesial reforms. Unfortunately, some of them believed that Vatican II could be implemented only in opposition to episcopal authority, end quote. In the memorandum from the Pastors' Forum, George was pejoratively dubbed Francis the Corrector. It seemed that Some argued that George was someone who didn't act quickly or diligently enough to fulfill his promise to the priests of Chicago on the eve of his installation. Because unlike Cardinal Bernardine's legendary self-introduction as Joseph, your brother, when he came to Chicago, George said, "I'm your bishop." But he added, "I will work very, very hard to become your brother." Although the issues they complained about fell properly within his duties of office, these priests objected to a variety of things about George's leadership, including how he wanted kneelers reinstalled at Mundelein Seminary Chapel, or his request that a high school change its theology textbooks to something in conformity with Catholic doctrine, or his insistence that lay ministers receive communion at the proper time. They also objected to George's opposition to suburban Oak Park's proposed ordinance on domestic partnerships, and his intention to welcome into the archdiocese priests from other countries and cultures. And they did their best to remind George that he had no experience as a parish pastor in his curriculum vitae. Regarding the liturgical abuses he found upon arriving in Chicago, well, it's true, George did, during his parish visits, sometimes address pastors about liturgical aberrations. He never did so to embarrass or to reprimand, but he did so to foster unity and bring about greater faith. He wrote in 2004, "Where there are aberrations in Eucharistic practice, quote, there are most probably more general difficulties in ecclesiastical discipline. And eventually there will be problems in professing the apostolic faith," end quote. He was a man who could see, who would connect the dots, could trace things out, play things out. At the same time, George saw these kind of things as unnecessary distractions to the church's mission. Another point of contention for many in Chicago's presbyterate was familiar to George in his years in Yakima, the use of general absolution, which he found to be unwarranted, especially in the contexts in which it was most commonly being employed. It took him many years to overcome the obstacles of being taken to the task by these priests, but he eventually put an end to the practice and adopted a stance on the issue much more in accord with the church's norms. This rejection that George faced when he came to Chicago was not something new to him, of course. And the rejection owed to disability and the various physical effects in his life gave a framework for him to accept this. And later it would give a framework for him to accept the cancer that he battled for the last 9 years of his life. His own resignation in 2014 was hastened by the toll that cancer was taking on his life. It gave rise to yet another twist in God's providence in his own life, in that this boy who left Chicago on crutches, who was determined to be a priest despite rejection, ended up leaving his final Mass as Archbishop of Chicago in 2014, walking down the aisle of Holy Name Cathedral with crutches. Infections and the cancer that was wreaking havoc on him meant that he couldn't walk on his own. But it was at that Mass that we learned something very, very intriguing, at least I find it so. He was responding in his homily that day to persistent questions about his legacy. What is the legacy of his time as Archbishop? In speaking about it, he spoke nothing about his robust tenure as one of the most respected bishops in the country, but he diverted the question back to Christ. He said, quote, "At some point, Christ will question me, what have you done with my people? Are they holier because of your ministry? Are they more generous? Are they more loving toward others? In short, you are my legacy. The people of the archdiocese are what I will point to when the Lord asks me, what have you done with my gift to you? The people of the archdiocese are what I point to when the media and others ask, what is your legacy? Have I been at times too fearful to speak, to act, to love generously? Sometimes, certainly. but others can note that even when I don't. But have I invested myself in the people so that they are better able to know and live their faith, able to worship God in spirit and in truth, able to give themselves for the salvation of others? Yes. It fascinates me that Cardinal George himself wanted to be remembered only as a conduit for Christ's action in the church and in the world, as one who encouraged his people to glorify Christ in all that we say, all that we do. And not only that, but that he gave a lasting example of how to do it. In the end, we're all faced with the task of making our own faith credible, of living authentic Christian lives, in allowing Christ to live in us. And as Christ's priestly prayer at Holy Thursday instructs us, it is those who glorify him who are consecrated in the truth and sent into the world so that the world may believe. In a way, Cardinal George took that mission seriously, especially how he persevered among suffering to love his own. And we can see, therefore, how he glorified Christ. Many of the stories that I heard in my nearly 7 years of research of how he was a friendly voice to someone diagnosed with cancer, how he shepherded a priest troubled with personal crisis, how he was a voice for victims of clergy sexual abuse, even in the halls of the Vatican, how he was a prophet and could read the signs of the times and call people to conversion, how he was a friend to a troubled parishioner who had no one else to speak to and gave his private number, how he was a generous boss and would give personal loans out of his own money to his staff, how he was a neighbor who could talk to you as if you were the only person who mattered, how he was a cardinal who could provide leadership his brother bishops needed, how he was a pastor weakened by cancer and on crutches who gave every last ounce of energy to some kids at the cathedral who wanted to meet him one afternoon. A man of suffering who nonetheless daily offered himself to Christ for the good of others. Cardinal George was a man who glorified Christ because he was a man who was Christ's own. Of all that I read and heard in my research of Cardinal George's love for his people, his legacy was an account offered by Tom Roser, which I include in the book. Tom Roser recounted how he witnessed Cardinal George's pastoral skills at the bedside of his dying priest cousin, Father George Helfrich, in 2006. Roser's words were especially significant because he was a longtime critic of Cardinal George, especially since he once essentially attacked George as a, quote, fashionable liberal old duffer, and, quote, a smallish, balding ex-university professor who, quote, scaled the bishopric with those hands soft as a woman's. He continued in his 2006 account, however, with a very emotional tale, which he spoke very admiringly of George. Quote, lowering his head and speaking distinctly so as to be heard by Father Helfrich, the prelate spoke to him in calm, measured, and powerfully edifying tones, Roser wrote. Quote, Cardinal George was saying, quote, George, the Lord Jesus Christ loves you, as Roser recounted, in a voice that gave a kind of thrilling affirmation of the fact. The Cardinal continued in Roser's account, quote, moreover, all the suffering you are enduring and have endured is being put up for you as a treasure for eternal reward. And let there be no mistake, all of us must one day face the same trial that you do today. And God grant that we will do so with the courage you are exhibiting today, which is an inspiration to us all. You are indeed a champion, and we are very proud of you and love you. End quote. Roser argued that not only did he hear these exquisite words that day, but more significantly, quote, the tender solicitude of a loving father, the gentle stroking of the dying priest's brow, the brushing back of his unkempt, disheveled hair, the prelate's soft patting of the patient's sagging, stubble-filled cheeks with the skill of a medical nurse, end quote. For Roser, George's care for his dying priest cousin that day was done, quote, with such care that the medical personnel standing around waited to react in case of emergency were completely stunned. What Roser saw that day was something that many came to know about George, and many cameras were never there to report about. Quote, as Roser said, quote, "This was a cardinal who knew how to soothe, who could easily become, with the delicacy and grace he showed, an expert caregiver himself," end quote. And he did. His pastoral gift that was never spotted by the cameras, or at least very rarely was constant and a regularity. Those who lived with him often told me they never heard him complain about his nonstop schedule, but instead they saw him go about his tasks with a sense of purpose, always giving witness to the Lord and offering himself. Perhaps the worst episode of his time in Chicago was the clergy sexual abuse crisis that circled around Daniel McCormick, the West Side priest with a sketchy seminary record who ended up being Chicago's worst serial predator. In the midst of that scandal, George was concerned for the health of the archdiocese, and he wrote to his flock, quote, "The sins of priests and bishops destroy the church, and I pray that our archdiocese will not be harmed," end quote. But he continued, quote, "What happens to me in all this is of small importance. What happens to the archdiocese is of great importance. It is not God's will that the archdiocese be torn apart, but God depends on our cooperation to prevent its being harmed and to make it stronger," end quote. Above all, George needed cooperation from his priests, as I mentioned earlier, and in the wake of the McCormick scandal, George made an urgent and bold plea in a never-published private memo to priests that if any of them were engaged in nefarious activity, they should make themselves known. Quote, "To be honest with you, I often feel like I'm walking on quicksand here. There is so much that I remain unaware of, yet I am in the end responsible for it all. I want to say now that if there is any priest who is leading a double life, who is engaged in dishonest or sinful practices that destroy the church, he should, for the sake of the church, come forward. If a priest cannot change and convert anew, he should leave his sacred office in the church. People rightly have high standards for us, the standards the church herself gives us, and which each of us has freely accepted. All of us are sinners, but there are types of perversion that are completely incompatible with the calling of ordained priesthood," end quote. Find me another bishop who would write something like that. In subsequent weeks and months, to his credit, there were many priests who came to his office and admitted their failings and left public ministry. In response to the systemic failures in the archdiocesan chancery that were exposed and the collapse surrounding the McCormick scandal, George called for a thorough independent investigation, something of a first in any American diocese. And he put a layman in charge, his chancellor, Jimmy Legault. He wanted to bring about a comprehensive, effective, and prompt response on the part of the archdiocese to how the system fell apart, that a priest abused on his watch. George yet again depended on Legault's background, serving as a child abuse investigator, as he had done in 2002, when the Bishop of Springfield, Daniel Ryan, was being investigated. That was also something of a first, that Cardinal George relied upon a layman to investigate another bishop, something that we were asking for in 2018, and Rome stopped the U.S. bishops from taking that action. But George did that. He also had a problem with how the state handled the McCormick disaster, and he took on the DCFS privately as well, because he felt that McCormick would not have abused again on his watch if the DCFS would have acted. For example, the archdiocese, including George, had no knowledge that the DCFS had, quote, found credible evidence of child abuse or neglect against McCormick, end quote. McCormick was informed by the DCFS in a letter in 2005, but this crucial document was not shared with the archdiocese until after the priest was arrested a second time for abuse. Cardinal George said in a deposition in 2008, quote, "With all my heart, I wish they would have given me that letter." Instead, this ended up being the albatross that hung around the Cardinal's neck until the day he died. He said, quote, "They gave that letter to Dan McCormick. Had they given it to me, he would have been out immediately," end quote. George followed up on this news to his priests in a letter and said, quote, "There is more than irony in the claim that going only to the state will result in immediate action, when quite the contrary is what happened to me here." He told Chicago priests in 2012, quote, "If there was any cover-up with McCormick, it's with the civil authorities," end quote. He didn't cover up anything. He admitted his fault. Not his fault, but the archdiocesan fault. He was not served well, as I recount in the book, by his archdiocesan chancery around that. The media beat him up for it unfairly. And he took the sword for the people who worked for him. In relationship to this, there was also the way that Cardinal George responded to victims of clergy sexual abuse. He gave witness to the Lord and offered himself by carrying their cross with them. He had a heart for victim survivors of abuse. He regularly met with them, and his honesty and candor came across many times when he would speak about the victims of abuse. He called upon St. Paul's instruction to the Colossians in a column in the archdiocesan paper, in which St. Paul said, quote, "Now I rejoice in my sufferings for your sake, and in my flesh I am filling up for what is lacking in the afflictions of Christ on behalf of his body, which is the church." And then he continued to write in his own words, "In the body of Christ we profit from others' virtues, but we suffer from others' sins. All the saints did penance for the sins of others. They did so because their souls were attuned to the movements of the Holy Spirit in the church and in the world. Many who are most attuned to the demands of social justice recognize that the exploitation of another human being is the consequence of sin and the root of injustice. People with well-developed spiritual antennae can see and hear a world created in love, fallen in sin, yet free now by Christ. And believing this, we can take upon ourselves the spiritual work of reparation for sin, including the sin of the sexual abuse of children." End quote. George relied on prayer as a means to move forward. He made a pilgrimage to Lourdes to make reparation for the sins of clergy. He was convinced that the Lord wanted the church to move through this crisis, but he was also convinced that a purification was necessary. He said, quote, "Purification is very painful, but necessary. There were nights, and I'm sure there will be again, when I didn't sleep very well, but that didn't matter to him. What mattered was the church's credibility and the church's ability to bring Christ to others." It's very interesting to me that in 2019, 4 years after he died, during an international summit on clergy sexual abuse held at the Vatican, after all the cover-ups and scandals reemerged, particularly related to the notorious abuser Theodore McCarrick, there were 5 victims who were invited to address the Pope and the bishops gathered at that assembly. 5 victim survivors, 1 from the United States. George ended up being the only bishop mentioned by name at that meeting, and he was held up as a model for leadership amid the sex scandals that plagued the church. The survivor, Mike Hoffman from the Archdiocese of Chicago, said, quote, "One of my finest memories of Francis Cardinal George is when he spoke about the difficulties of fellow priests who have abused. And I considered those words, coming from a man in his position, even though they must be really hard for him to say, they were right and the proper thing to say. I thought that that was leadership at the time, and I think it's leadership now. And I thought if he could put himself out there and lead by example, then I could put myself out there and think of other survivors and other Catholics and faithful people can put themselves out there to work for resolution and work for healing and work for a better church." End quote. Asked what he hoped people would remember about him 50 years after he was gone, Cardinal George said that he hoped his people would, quote, remember that I've tried very hard to love them. That's what a bishop is supposed to do. That's what a parish priest is supposed to do. Love the people whom God has given you to pastor and care for, end quote. And isn't that what we see when we look at the crucified Christ? Isn't that what we see in all that he did and all that he said? In all that he did and all that he said, Francis George gave witness to that very thing, Christ crucified, in his own person and in the way he offered his life. Throughout his life, Cardinal George had proved himself an outstanding religious, a born leader, a go-getter. With his razor-sharp intellect and scintillating mind, George might have been the smartest guy in the room, and he might have rubbed others the wrong way at times. But it's hard to find the outlier who didn't respect him for his commitment, for his vision, for his sense of humor, for his convictions, for his example and encouragement of others who endeavored to answer the Lord's call. And he did so just as much as I found a private writing from 2007, quote, hopeless sinner though I am, Lord, make me a saint for the sake of your people, end quote. Cardinal George laid down his life for his friends. He poured out his life for others. In his own words, quote, the only thing we take with us when we die is what we have given away, end quote. George's was a life lived in imitation of Christ, one who carried the cross for a purpose, who chose to keep going and keep giving to the life of the world. And it seemed most fitting then for those who went to his wake and funeral that the image he chose to be on the prayer card given to those who attended was not his own picture, as is the case with most bishops, but the crucified Christ with blood and water gushing forth from his pierced side. I think that's an icon of how Cardinal George gave to the end, and himself was a model of that image for us all. In these days, when we look for good leaders, when we look for faithful disciples in the church, I think we can look to Cardinal George as an example of what that looks like. Because he was completely Christ's, because he glorified Christ by his life, George was someone who could clearly articulate the faith, who disposed his brilliance to the service of the church, who brought unity to his brother bishops, who was committed to reform, who was honest and accountable, who was genuine and authentic, who was holy. Because he was completely Christ, he was a man for all, and he will remain so for all ages. And his witness will continue to bear fruit because it's life-giving. In my view, any examination of Cardinal George's life then makes clear that above all else, glorifying Christ was his aim. May we learn from the example he left us, and by the help of his prayers, may we ourselves persevere in becoming completely Christ's. To Christ be glory in the church. Thank you.
We usually take a few questions at the conclusion of the talk, so does anybody want to, in the meantime, I don't know how many people, I know many people in this room did know Cardinal George, had encounters with him. I did not at this level at all, but I can still picture him. The one image that comes to mind when you're speaking of his polio and so forth, if you've ever been to the Mass preceding the March for Life in D.C. at the Basilica, there's this long procession of bishops. And it was so gratifying every time in that line we would see Cardinal George. I don't know if the current cardinal has ever been to the Mass for Life, but George was a regular, and he would limp. And I always thought, okay, he had polio, it's an after effect of some kind. I suspect he was overcoming a great deal of pain to make those kinds of appearances. Yeah. Any questions? All right. What? I'm sorry. I'll get you next. Go ahead. No, go ahead. But speak up. We don't have a mic, so.
Okay. I have two questions. One is, what was your interest in did you know Cardinal George, and how did you come to be so interested to research and write this book? The second question is that quote that's always said of him, that he said that he would die in his bed, his predecessor would die in jail, and his predecessor would be martyred. Is that
Successor.
true?
Successor.
Successor. Oh, I'm sorry. Is that really true, and did he say that?
I can answer the second one. He definitely said it, yeah.
Just to mention first about the pain, you know, his sister told me, I say in the book, there was never a day he wasn't in severe pain after the polio. He had to wear a brace on his leg the last 40 years or so of his life. And that was constantly a source of agony and pain. So going on an airplane, all those sorts of things that he would have to do were always a continual offering of himself. That quote that you mentioned about the cardinal, and I'll get to the first question at the end there. He did say it. He was not meaning to be a prophet, as many people intended him to be with their interpretations of it. It was leaked from a priest at a convocation of priests in Louisiana, where Cardinal George was a speaker. He captured it on his cell phone. And so it's taken a little bit out of context. And the cardinal had tried to follow up with a column, I think, on that to try to give the context. That never got the widespread distribution that the quote did. But one of the priests at the assembly had asked the cardinal, this was in the midst of the Obama administration, what's the worst that could happen? And that's when you got that story. It was a mind experiment for the cardinal. So, well, I'll die in bed, my successor will die in jail, his successor will die a martyr in the public square. Usually the quote ends there. The cardinal hated that. The quote continues, he says, his successor will pick up the broken pieces of society and restore society as the church has done throughout the centuries. There's a message of hope in the end. Why did I do this book? Well, no one else was doing it, and I was willing enough to do it. I was always fascinated by Cardinal George. I got to meet him several times when I was a student at the Catholic University of America in Washington, D.C. He was president of the USCCB at the time, and was on the board of trustees for the university. So he was in and out quite a bit. And he always stayed with his community. He didn't stay at a hotel like the other bishops. He stayed across the street with the Oblates of Mary Immaculate. And so he would come for Mass in the Basilica and things like that. I would see him, and he would remember who I was, and we'd talk. And when he died, like so many other people, I was thinking, well, how can we remember his legacy? What can I do? I think all of us should do something to keep his legacy alive. What could I do? I'm nobody. What could I do? I wanted to do something. And what I wanted to do at first was try to collect his columns from the Archdiocesan newspaper and maybe come up with a volume sorted by topic or whatever. And I was told someone else was doing that, but I subsequently found that project fell apart for different reasons. But in the midst of that, I was told by many people to think about doing a biography. And I brought that to prayer quite a bit. Before the Blessed Sacrament, I was teaching high school theology at the time. And I thought, well, the Lord seems to be drawing me in this direction. I've talked to so many people who are interested and willing to work with me, and maybe these doors are opening for a reason. And so I just kept moving forward. And believe me, there were a lot of obstacles that I encountered along the way and wanted to give up a dozen times. But I felt really strongly that the Lord wanted his story told. So I hope that I've done some justice to it.
Yes, very
My question is about the first one. What exactly attracted you to him? Was there a moment or a time when you met him that put you into his extraordinary?
Someone I recently was talking to summed it up best, which I experienced myself, which is that when you were in his presence, there was a certain aura to him. I know in having talked to him myself, I felt very much that he was attentive to just you when he was talking to you. And that seems to be a certain charismatic gift. So that was an attractive thing. And of course, I was a student in theology, so I was very interested in his columns, and his teaching, his nuanced way of thinking. And, I think in the last decade or more, many of us are looking for good leaders in the church, and we lost one in the midst of that time. And I kept thinking, instead of complaining, people, which we have rights to do, there are reasons to complain. But instead of doing that, why don't we maybe also put the microscope on someone who we had in our midst, who can show us a better way, and who didn't get the attention he deserved when he was with us.
Mary Ann, I'll let you have the last one. And by the way, Tom Roser, for those of you who don't know, was actually the co-founder of this organization, along with Mary Ann Hackett, who just stood up to ask a question. And I'm sure she wasn't going to just tell us about that, but those who knew Tom Roser, he's just an amazing guy, died pretty prematurely in my view, and it was a great loss to the city, really. Yes, Mary Ann?
And to the Catholic Church, actually.
Yeah.
I just wanted to comment about a personal experience with Cardinal George, and that is, we often went to events, pro-life events at different parishes around the diocese, and he would stand and greet everybody that wanted to visit with him, even though there were long lines. Sometimes he'd be standing for over an hour, and it must have been very painful. He was just charming when you finally got up in the line. He was very friendly and charming to everybody. And it always impressed me that with his disability that he was able to do that for people in his diocese.
I heard that time and again, and I can't help but think there had to be some sort of supernatural grace that he had, because I don't know how he was able to physically withstand the obligations of his office. Having known more intimately about his health, when he had his bladder removed in 2006, they created an artificial bladder, which means physically you don't have the nerves to tell yourself when to go to the bathroom and so on. He had to wear a special watch. He had to get up all night, every 2 or 3 hours. He never had a night's sleep the last 10 years of his life. And I don't know how he did all that stuff. He was elected president of the Bishops' Conference the next year after his bladder was removed. There was really something very heroic about him, very special about him. But he never, ever elaborated on that himself. And he just continued to give. And even the sisters, the Albertine sisters who ran his household for him and kind of kept a prayer nucleus around his house that other archbishops never had. He brought them in. They said, he would spend hours on his knees in prayer with that brace on. I don't know how he did that. There really is something amazing about him. And just a side note, he wanted to be buried with that leg brace, which I can't help but think if one day he might be canonized and his grave is exhumed, we're going to find his body healed.
Okay, on that note, that very uplifting note, again, I remind you, we have speakers of this ilk every month. I hope you all can return next month. We have Father John Perricone, and he's speaking on 4 profoundly simple proposals for the USCCB's Eucharistic Revival. As you all may know, the bishops are spending millions and millions of dollars with this program to revive the Eucharist, and Father Perricone has an alternative way to do it. I think you'll find it very interesting and enlightening. In closing, I'd also mention, to do these speakers, we need to be able to fund them. And today I left on the table envelopes that you can take with you. I'm not asking you to fill it out now, but take it with you. Give it some thought, some prayerful thought, and see if you can't support us. All of us, we are all volunteers. We have no paid staff. And this is one of our primary programs, and the only way to continue to do these is to get support from people like you all. So I hope you continue to attend. I hope you can see your way to supporting us financially, and have a great month.
Thank you.